Hi guys, today I'm going to be talking about something slightly different from the normal. Alternate history. I made a map that is an alternate history of if the Central Powers won the Great War. The war starts off the same. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, is shot, and Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, of course, defends Serbia, and Germany defends the Habsburgs. Russia joins the war for Russia, and Germany invades Luxembourg and Belgium to get around the French defenses, pulling the United Kingdom into the war on the side of the French and the Russians. When the Ottomans enter the war against Russia, the Ottomans are able to hold the line thanks to German military training and support given months before the Ottoman entry into the war. Japan enters the war for the German colonies in the Pacific. By 1915, Bulgaria also enters the war on the side of the Central Powers slightly earlier to remove Serbia and Montenegro from the war. This allows Austrian reinforcements to go to Galicia to defend from the Russians. The Central Powers get pushed to the gates of Warsaw and the Vistula River but are stopped, which the Russians call the Miracle at the Vistula. Italy enters the war and charges into South Tyrol, but fails to make progress, wasting equipment and manpower. In 1916, on the Western Front, the Germans get pushed back while Romania joins the Entente just to get utterly crushed by a Hungarian and Bulgarian offensive. The Arab revolt occurs but isn't as dramatic because of the Ottoman concessions in the Arab parts of the empire. Also, the Senussi revolt occurs, heavily distracting the Italian and Anglo-Egyptian forces. Russia surrenders, but it falls into revolution. Greece enters the war and the front is a stalemate because the UK and France do not choose to send reinforcements, as they fear a German offensive. This allows the Bulgarians alone to at least hold the line. Ethiopia also joins and conquers Eritrea while the Dervish campaign begins, but doesn't invade Ethiopian territories. The Germans and Austria-Hungarians prepare a final offensive on the Western and Italian fronts. Karl I of Austria-Hungary sends a manifesto that says he would create a third constituent state in Austria-Hungary after the war. This stalls the collapse of the empire. After much professional training by the Germans in the Austrian army, they are able to take Venice and are near Milan, which forces Italy to sign an armistice. The Great Offensive also begins, where the Germans move to siege Paris. When they succeed in besieging the city, the French sign an armistice in Frankfurt. The end of the war saw the signing of the Treaty of Strasbourg. In the Treaty of Strasbourg, Belgium is divided into Wallonia and Flanders. Both become German puppets, and parts of France are annexed by the two. Most British and French Pacific islands are taken by Germany along with French Indochina. Bulgaria takes Macedonia, Eastern Serbia, Greek Macedonia, Greek Thrace, and Romanian Dobruja. Austria takes Friuli. Austria also places Serbia under military occupation while they figure out whether to annex it or create a puppet there. Albania takes Kosovo. Germany annexes all French and Belgian colonies in sub-Saharan Africa into a new German Pan-African colony, Mittelafrika. Morocco becomes independent as a German puppet. Ethiopia annexed Eritrea while Somalia became independent. Libya and Egypt are puppeted by the Ottomans, but the city of Tripoli is directly administered by the Ottomans as a naval base. Germany also incorporates Portuguese Angola into Middle Africa. For the second time in 100 years, the German flag flew over Paris. The Second French Revolution was unsurprising to a German or British person living at that time period because the Communist Party in France was the biggest in Europe at the time. The revolution occurred during the Siege of Paris and the French surrender after fears of Germany occupying Paris, which spiraled into the biggest mutiny of the war and eventually revolution. The revolution became a civil war similar to Russia in 1917. In our timeline, where two sides formed. The communists, who had support from the French anarchists, and the nationalists, supported by far-right elements in the Action Française, a monarchist group in France. The nationalists also had a foreign ally, the UK, but even with that foreign support, the communists came out victorious because most of industrial France was left-leaning or communist. The nationalist government of France fled to Corsica, then Algeria, which allowed for the survival of the old republic in Africa. The communists who took power in metropolitan France set up the Commune of France. The communists' main end goal was to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine and to finish off the Republican government in Africa. More importantly at this point was that the communists here believed in the ideals of permanent revolution, which called for the constant expansion of communism around the globe, and Italy was the Commune of France's first target. The revolution in Italy was mainly supported in Piedmont and Tuscany. The revolutionaries here were stopped at the Apennine Range running down the center of Italy. In 1931, the French used espionage to boost the popularity of communism in the United Kingdom. The Conservative Party rigged the election in their favor, when really the Communist Party there won. This caused an uprising, which quickly spiraled into war between both sides, but they eventually came to a compromise in 1933 to give the parliament to a Liberal-Labor coalition temporarily, until new elections could be held. Speaking of revolutions, Russia was a nation in crisis. The only reason the whites won the Civil War was due to German intervention. The last parts of the Russian horde were whittled away as the whites and reds tore themselves apart. But it is over now, and Russia needs to pick up the charred pieces of its shattered empire. And the only way a new Russia held itself together was with a strong leader with an iron fist, Alexander Kolchak, who now must decide if he should give up power or hold on to it despite the lack of popularity after the end and the recovery from the Russian Civil War. The only benefits that Russia has right now is the opportunity to get a puppet in Mongolia under Ungern Sternberg, which is extremely unlikely, and align itself with the Islamic Republic of East Turkestan in China, which is also unlikely unless they create a secular state there. Speaking of China, the empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. Thus it has ever been. This is a quote from The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and it is true in the case of China. The Great Qing once ruled supreme over East Asia, but in 1911 the empire crumbled, giving way to a new republic. Instead of staying in the new Republic of China, 5-year-old Puyi, the emperor of the Qing, and other prominent Qing loyalists fled to the German Empire, which gave them an asylum. After the end of the Great War, Germany and the Qing government in exile began exploiting warlords called cliques to regain power, especially the Zili clique under Wu Peifu, which seized Beijing and allowed Puyi to return and named Puyi as his successor. Shortly afterwards, Wu Peifu died under suspicious circumstances. The Ma clique, Guanxi clique, Sichuan clique, and remnants of the Anhui clique pledged their nominal loyalty to the Qing. In the south, however, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party had much more influence and had allies in Guangdong and Yunnan. The Xinjiang clique were also allies of the Kuomintang because of their political alignment with them. Only two cliques managed to stay neutral, the Shaanxi clique and the Islamic Republic of Turkestan, the latter of which was competing for influence with the Xinjiang clique, but refused to align with the Qing because of the Qing's policy of China indivisible, which called for the complete reconquest of Qing-owned lands. Also, Manchuria was reconquered by the Japanese. Another area in Asia that was falling apart was the Indian subcontinent. India was divided into 3 factions: the princely states, the former Raj, and the communists. Other states in the Indian subcontinent were Bangladesh, an unstable Pakistan, Burma, Afghanistan, which has seized a small sliver of Pakistan, and Siam, which grabbed a sliver of Burma. Now, let's move on to the victors of this catastrophic war. For the Germans, now that the dust is settled, the Germans can get to rebuilding its economy, which wouldn't be that difficult except they had to manage their puppets in the east. Thanks to some economic reforms, the Germans were able to get back on track again and get their puppets' economies going. The Germans were in a similar position to France in our timeline, except with less pacifism. The Germans were starting to open up to democracy now because the war showed that the Kaiser could act as a figurehead and let lawmakers and generals do the business of lawmaking and doing war stuff. 2 months after the armistice was signed, the Germans intervened in Russia to stop the communist victory, because at this point, the Germans thought their new role in the world would be to stop the expansion of communism. After France fell to communism, the Germans knew that Western Europe was under threat. The Germans tried to intervene in Italy, but the support didn't arrive in time for the armistice. The next place that the communism struck was the United Kingdom, but the Germans saw an opportunity here. They would seize all British colonies in Africa except for Sudan and South Africa, and then send some support to Britain. The Sultanate of Darfur was re-established and took control of Sudan. The Third Boer War started as well, but basically it was put down with extraordinary violence and minor concessions. If we go back to the revolution in Italy, we can see another nation that decided to get involved: Austria. Austria seized Lombardy and Venetia and created a puppet there. Internally, however, Austria was a mess. The ethnic minorities of the empire, Croatians, Serbs, Slovenians, Romanians, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, and Czechs, were all unhappy. And the Habsburgs had to change that. As I mentioned earlier, Kaiser Karl I of Austria-Hungary signed a document saying that he would create a third constituent for the South Slavs of the empire. Well, now was the end of the war, and Karl had to keep that promise. He had to get permission from Hungary, however, who, after some concessions, allowed for. But now the people were calling for complete federalization, which Austria was ready to embrace, but the Hungarians were not allowing for. In Austria's eyes, they had to force the hand of Hungary, and the best way to do that was with revolt. What Austria did was stage a minority revolt in Hungary, refused to give military support unless Hungary accepts federalization, twisting Hungary's hand, and then federalizing. By 1936, this plan was almost complete, with the documents with Hungary being signed. But Austria-Hungary-Croatia, as it is called now, wasn't the only one with issues with minorities. So did the Ottomans, a struggling empire who was saved by the miraculous victory of the Central Powers in the Great War. The Ottomans are in a terrible position, as the Arab parts of the empire are planning revolt. The Ottoman solution is simple: integrate the Arabs through whatever means necessary. Destroy all feelings of Arab nationalism. In foreign relations, however, the Ottomans are able to lean into their Islamic and Turkic culture to create alliances with Jabal Shammar, Oman, and Iran. Quick side note, the Sultanate of Darfur is aligned with the Ottomans as well because of their proximity and for protection from the Germans and nationalist French. The Ottomans also have close relations with Afghanistan and East Turkestan. The last main member of the Central Powers is now Bulgaria. However, there isn't much to talk about with Bulgaria, other than they were in a sort of a great game with Romania and Greece, and if they lost a war with the two, Tsar Ferdinand I would be deposed in favor of his son, Boris. Also at this point, many of the Central Powers are distancing themselves from one another. So, what happens? So, what happens next? Well, I haven't fully hashed that out yet. My working theory is that Russia will become democratic or restore the Tsar, then we'll join the nationalist French and British in an alliance, like a second Entente. In 1939 or 1940, the British communists would declare war on Germany. The main thing I'm not sure about is if the second Entente would join the Germans or the communist French. At the moment, I'm thinking the Entente would join the Germans for the nationalist French and the Kingdom of Italy to regain their home country. I believe that there might be a couple of different scenarios that could occur, but that is where my ideas end. Speaking of ending, that was my alternate history, if Germany won World War I, and I hope you liked it. Thanks for watching. This alternate history took a while and was really fun. I'm currently working on another alternate history, which I think you'll like if you liked this one. Stay tuned for that one. If you would like any other alternate history scenarios done, please comment below. And I usually change these maps slightly, so if we could get 1,000 subs so I could send community posts, that would be wonderful. I hope you have a great day. Thank you for watching.